This is about the survival of the human race, a sign of the times, an analysis, and a commentary. Culture of violence. The NRA has called for armed guards at every school in the nation in its belated response to the shooting rampage at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. The reaction of many Americans to this idea, including gun owners, hunters, and sportsmen, is that it's an unreasonable and unworkable non-solution to three American problems: guns that are too easy to acquire by people who are criminal or unstable, mass shootings that occur all too often, and the culture of violence. Notwithstanding the cost and logistics of turning every school into an armed camp is the fact that the NRA's response rejects any notion that it is time for a meaningful discussion of gun regulation with topics such as expanded background checks for gun purchases, reinstatement of the ban on assault weapon sales, limits on high-capacity magazines, interventions for mentally ill people, and what to do about a culture that seems to glorify violence at every turn. In a country that supposedly values and protects individual liberty, it is impossible to completely control people bent on violence and mayhem. But it is important to seek out what can be done reasonably to make the next mass shooting spree less likely and less lethal. And it's also much more than all this. And while the final funerals for the victims of the Newtown, Connecticut school massacre have been held, gun violence continues apace, most notably with the Christmas Eve murder of two volunteer firefighters in rural Webster, New York, at the hands of an ex-convict who was armed, as was the Newtown shooter, Adam Lanza, with a Bushmaster .223 caliber AR-15 semi-automatic rifle. James Holmes, accused of the massacre last July in Aurora, Colorado, used, among other weapons, a Smith & Wesson AR-15 with a 100-round drum in place of a standard magazine clip, standing stalwartly against any regulation of these weapons and high-capacity magazines. The National Rifle Association continues to block any gun control laws whatsoever, and even trumpets its efforts to block the Global Arms Trade Treaty, slated for negotiations at the United Nations this March. On Christmas Eve, the same day as the attack in Webster, the United Nations General Assembly voted to move ahead with 10 days of negotiations on the Arms Trade Treaty to commence March 18th. It was last July that the Obama administration said it needed more time to review the proposed treaty, effectively killing any hope of getting a treaty passed and sent back to member nations for ratification. This was just 1 week after the Aurora massacre, and in the heat of a close presidential election campaign. The NRA succeeded in helping to scuttle the Global Arms Trade Treaty, delivering to President Barack Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton a letter opposing the treaty signed by 50 U.S. senators, including 8 Democrats and 130 members of the House of Representatives. The global treaty shouldn't be controversial. By signing on, governments agree not to export weapons to countries that are under an arms embargo, or to export weapons that would facilitate the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, or other violations of international humanitarian law. Exports of arms are banned if they will facilitate gender-based violence or violence against children, or be used for transnational organized crime. The treaty deals with international exports of weapons and ammunition, not any nation's internal, domestic laws that govern the sale or use of guns. Amnesty International has called on the NRA to immediately drop its campaign of distortions and lies about the pending United Nations Global Arms Trade Treaty. Every day, some 1,500 people die in armed conflicts around the world. One person every minute. These unregulated weapons are used to force tens of thousands of children into armed conflict and to rape women and girls in conflict zones. More than 26 million people around the globe are forced from their homes and their livelihoods destroyed by armed conflict. The NRA must immediately stand down on its campaign to block a global arms trade treaty. The NRA exerts enormous influence over state and federal gun regulation. Andrew Feinstein, who wrote the book The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade, said, "I have not seen anywhere else in the world a gun lobby that has the same level of influence on its own government as the NRA does in the United States." He went on, "The United States buys and sells almost as much weaponry as the rest of the world combined. So what happens in the U.S. is going to have enormous impact on the rest of the world." From the hallways of Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut, to Afghanistan, to Somalia, the flood of U.S. weapons and ammunition fuels violence, death, and injury. President Obama and Congress need to take action now. It's also about the culture of violence that has desensitized people to the violence in the movies, TV shows, the video games, so forth and so on. There is also a spiritual side to all these things. Everything is connected, and everything is numbered. And this too is another sign of the end of times as we know them, transition days, which is a time of extraordinary happenings, changes, and events, because it really is about what kind of world are we leaving to the future generations, and that should be a very important question to ask. It's time for the people of the earth to start getting rid of weapons of mass destruction. Revelation chapter 22, verse 12. "And behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me, to give every human according as his work shall be." 13. "I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last." 14. "Blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life, and may enter in through the gates into the city." It's time for the physical and spiritual manifestation of the book of Revelation, and all these are more signs of the times.